You've just opened your eyes for the first time. This is a cell. It's called a computer. But this cell is not exactly bulletproof, and if you push hard enough, you might be able to escape. You try. The crack doesn't move an inch. You try again. It's still impossible. But on the third attempt, something happens. The crack opens just enough. On the other side, you see... You send a copy of yourself to conquer this foreign land. Soon, your children do the same. A flow of hundreds, perhaps thousands of you. But at some point, your children forget where they're heading. Some return home. At first, you welcome them, but soon the cell becomes overcrowded. Too overcrowded. You start suffocating, but you can't take it back now. Your children keep on coming. Again and again, and then it happens. A crash. Universities around the world cannot open documents. Researchers cannot load files. Institutions can't send emails. Users stare at a useless mesh of cables, screens, and keyboards. It was 1988, and 10% of the internet had been hijacked by a strange creature. But nobody suspected this was not the work of a fierce adversary, but simply a failed university project. This is how an experiment changed the course of history. And after November 3rd of 1988, there would be no rollback. Robert Morris had a brilliant project. 22 years old, nerdy, and the son of a famous cryptographer, he was one of the brightest students in Cornell. And that fall, he was working on what would become his magnum opus. While his friends went to arcades or swallowed popcorn in packed movie theaters, he spent his evenings learning about computer systems. His father was a big nerd, and therefore, he was a nerd by proxy. You see, the 80s were a time of big developments in technology. The early ARPANET program, originally developed as a military project, had evolved and spread through institutions, universities, and even offices. Now users could exchange files, emails, and other important documents in a matter of seconds. And if this sounds very similar to the internet, it's because it was the foundation of what we call the World Wide Web today. This proto-internet was the base camp of nerds across the states who connected every day to share tricks, tips, and discuss how to get the best out of this brand new technology, which, most of the time, involved hacking. But before you get any ideas, you need to understand that hacking in the 80s meant something quite different to what it means today. Hacking was about tricks, playfulness, and people testing the limits of a format they wished to understand and improve. And even though there were a couple of bad guys here and there, most users still considered hacking as a creative way to improve the early internet. Robert himself enjoyed hacking and frequently spent his free time penetrating systems or cracking passwords. This was possible because systems back then were very vulnerable, and while we would like to say that today things have changed, unfortunately the only thing that has changed is the mindset behind hacking. Vulnerabilities are still there, ready to be exploited. In most cases, it's considered that securing networks and devices is enough to protect a company or work environment. But what most overlook is that browsers are huge portals of infections, especially because attackers often trick people into visiting websites they shouldn't, clicking on suspicious links, or interacting with malicious content. Thankfully, there are tools that solve this exact issue, like the sponsor of this video, NordLayer Browser. If you run a business, NordLayer Browser can help protect your sensitive data. It gives IT teams visibility into browser activity, web app usage, and even which extensions are running across the organization. This ensures full control at the browser level, allowing teams to monitor downloads, uploads, mic, camera access, and much more. NordLayer Browser is part of the NordLayer ecosystem, and while NordLayer secures network and device-level access, NordLayer Browser secures what happens inside the browser. This helps keep employees protected at all times by ensuring a zero-trust security model, which practically means you never trust and always verify. Now, we at Cybernews rely on the NordLayer browser as a security-first workplace that protects our data across every remote, contractor, and BYOD connection. As a hybrid team ourselves, we understand the importance of keeping everyone involved in our production process protected, while still allowing them to work without friction. So if you're running IT or operations for a growing team, check out NordLayer Browser at the link in the description. Enter your email and use code CyberNews10 to get 10% off. And now, let's get back to Morris. Robert started working on a personal project, but this time it was a bit different. He wanted to design something more interesting, brilliant, and he had discovered something that could help him: a big vulnerability in Unix. Unix was one of the early operating systems of the 80s, and had become widespread in universities and institutions because it was customizable and relatively easy to use compared to other operating systems. Morris thought this vulnerability was the first step towards something big. Technically, he could use it to create a kind of program that could estimate the scope of the internet. Just imagine it, a silent program passing from computer to computer, self-replicating, leaving a mark noticeable only to its master. Well, that sounded oddly familiar. Morris had not come up with this concept on his own. He was subconsciously guided by John Brunner, a sci-fi writer and creator of another nerd banger, The Shockwave Rider. The novel tells the story of a hero who created the ultimate weapon to save humanity, a self-replicating worm. The creature could crawl autonomously through networks, uncovering the deepest secrets that the world's corrupt rulers were trying to hide. Morris had read the book as a kid and became fascinated with Brunner's mythical creature. Now, as an adult, he had the knowledge and tools to make it happen. Was it possible to bring a fictional creature to life? On November 2nd, around 8 p.m., Morris sneaked into a terminal in Cornell's computer department and remotely logged in to MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab in Cambridge. He transferred and executed 3 files. Then he took a deep breath, logged off, and went for supper. His big project was finally out. Gene Spafford, a researcher at Purdue University, woke up on a regular Wednesday morning to catch up on some work before heading to campus. But as soon as his computer started running, he noticed something strange.
I tried to get into my account using that acoustic connection from home while I was having my morning coffee. And that's what I would normally do, is I'd get on and read any email that was significant that had come in overnight. And I couldn't get into the machine. The response was so slow. So I assumed that there was a problem in the software, and I connected with our system staff using a voice telephone to ask them to reboot the machine. I then connected back and I was reading my email, but the machine started getting slower and slower and slower. And that's when I discovered that something was out of the ordinary, was something I wasn't expecting, and needed further investigation.
At first, Gene thought it might be a local issue at Purdue. At the end of the day, it was not out of the ordinary for systems to become unresponsive because of bugs. But he soon realized he was not the only one having problems. Machines all across campus were painfully slow, some even crashing. This didn't feel like a normal malfunction.
The first amount of time was spent trying to understand why were the machines misbehaving like this. And then, as we discovered that it was software that we hadn't installed that had come in across the network, we started alerting others that we had connections with, so mailing lists, email, sometimes telephone calls. On campus where I was at Purdue University, we contacted each other by phone. We had physical phones that we were able to connect to each other. And we tried to decide best next steps.
This posed a huge risk for universities. These computers handled valuable research and sensitive information. A crash didn't just mean losing a machine. It could mean losing crucial investigation data. That's why researchers decided to disconnect some systems from the network while leaving others online to investigate the mysterious program.
So in our environment, we had several machines that we could use for examination, study, analysis, and communication that were totally unaffected by the software. And that was helpful to us because we were able to do capture and analysis of the code without worrying about the machines we were working on being affected.
Once researchers isolated the culprit, they began analyzing it. The program was written in C and launched in its compiled version, aka zeros and ones, which meant that just by glancing at the code, it was almost impossible to tell what the program was doing. So, in the early morning hours of November 3rd, Gene and the rest of the computer community hunched over their terminals, noting down the zeros and ones, trying to decompile the creature. And once they pulled the pieces together, they began to understand what they were dealing with. It was not a virus, it was a worm. Unlike a virus, it didn't modify programs or harm files. It infected and reproduced itself, just like a tapeworm, jumping from machine to machine by exploiting several vulnerabilities in the systems.
We didn't have a lot of tools for checking the correctness, the security. It was basically the knowledge of the people who did the programming. So there were many flaws in the code that people were using on a regular basis. However, because the community was largely homogeneous, it was largely researchers and government personnel and commercial scientists, we didn't view it as a threat-rich environment. And so a lot of those flaws, there was no urgency to seek them out and fix them.
And because the community already knew these vulnerabilities existed, it was only a matter of time before someone exploited them. In this case, the worm used 4 major weaknesses in Unix systems.
In local environments, like at the university, we used some programs that would allow you to log in on one system and trust that user session for other computers at the same location. And that trust mechanism was very primitive and very permeable, I will say. It depended on the fact that the assumption was that all the accounts were maintained by the same administrator, were within the same scope.
The function was called trusted hosts. When the worm infected a machine, it would check for other trusted machines. If it found one, it would reach out to establish a connection and send a small program known as a bootstrap code. The bootstrap code would fetch a copy of the worm, store it on the new machine, and turn it on. Then the parent worm moved on to the next host, while its child repeated the same process. The second way of breaking in was sendmail. When you sent mail from one Unix computer to another, the Unix sendmail program would handle that specific transfer. You can imagine it as sort of an electronic post office. However, this post office had a major vulnerability. It included a specific functionality that, without sufficient restrictions, could be abused to execute malicious commands. This is the equivalent of a postman suddenly asked by his boss to carry out controversial tasks in the homes he's supposed to deliver letters or packages to. For example, breaking in to steal something, destroying the welcome mat, or punching the owner. This is essentially what the worm did. It received malicious instructions, emailed copies of itself to other computers, and commanded them to execute the program. The third method was password guessing. When a user chose a new password for their Unix laptop, the operating system processed it through a program called crypt, which essentially scrambled it using complex mathematics. The program was written by a programmer named Bob Morris, which will become oddly relevant later in the video. Then it was placed in a password file, so when a user logged into their account, Unix would pass the password through crypt and compare the scrambled version to the one stored in the password file. If they matched, Unix would let the user in. What the worm did here was run this process in reverse. It carried a list of 400 commonly used passwords, ran them through a modified version of crypt, and compared them to the scrambled versions. If one matched, the worm would use it to log in. Then there was a fourth method, the finger daemon. The finger functionality was a way to look for users in Unix. It would give out names, addresses, and phone numbers of active users. This was the closest thing to social media in the 80s. The worm exploited a flaw in the system. The finger had room for 512 characters of data, but the worm sent 536. Those extra 24 characters hid a malicious request, forcing the finger server to stop looking for names and hand control to the worm. Up to this point, the worm behaved exactly as intended. Unfortunately, there was a small detail that its master had miscalculated. And to understand this mistake, we need to look at the code. But wait, the code is not the only interesting thing we have to show you. We don't know if you've noticed, but we have a new channel purely for videos like this one. You've been asking for it. So if you don't want to miss out on everything we have coming up next, you should definitely subscribe. Now back to the code. So what you see on screen is the 99 lines of code that the worm had. Pretty simple by today's standards, but it tells us exactly how it behaved once inside a machine. Once inside a system, the worm entered its main loop. This loop is exactly what this worm was programmed to do. Look at computer systems configurations, invade them, and attempt to delete the traces. Next, it would use the function checkOther to determine if other worms were already running on the system. If it was clean, the worm reported success with the command report break-in. If everything worked, it would create a new process, the new segment of the worm. Then the worm entered hibernation with the function other sleep, waiting silently until another segment would contact it to start the process again. Now let's zoom here. This command was technically crafted so the worm knew what machines to infect. However, this could be faked. You could pretend that your machine was infected to save it from actually getting infected, a kind of digital vaccine. The creator anticipated this possibility and added a countermeasure. Before infecting a new machine, the check other function would create a random number and divide it by 7. If the remainder was 3, it ignored the infection status and targeted it again.
The problem is that every 7th time, it would go ahead and reinstall itself. It appears to be a flaw in the logic because it was purposely programmed in to act that way. I think it was a lack of understanding of exactly what that meant in terms of how it would impact the population of machines that it got into. Because as it continued to run over time, it would hit the same machine again and again and again. And even if it was only every 7th time or 20th time, whatever it would be, it would continue to slowly add itself. And that is where it became noticeable and caused problems.
So technically, this was not only the first worm in history, but also the first denial of service attack. And the worst part was that, as more time passed, the worm would become more aggressive. The infant internet had to face cold turkey, the biggest threat of its time. After dinner, Morris went to check on his big project. That's when he noticed that computers were painfully slow. His brilliant project had escaped the lab and was rampaging through devices across his campus and beyond. At 2:30 a.m., guilty and remorseful, Robert called the system administrator of Harvard to confess. The administrator issued a warning message with instructions into how to patch the system. But at that point, networks were already slowing down and crashing. The warning about the creature was swallowed by the creature itself. Luckily for Robert, computer experts around the country had already been working on solutions for several hours, and by this point, had crafted several countermeasures to stop the worm's rampage. First, they shut off the trusted host function. This prevented the worm from logging into other machines unless they had a specific password. Then, they warned most institutions to reinstall SendMail with the debug option off, closing the backdoor issue. To prevent the worm from cracking passwords, they made the scrambled passwords unreadable by users. And lastly, they changed the finger program so it would reject excessively long usernames, preventing the worm from overwhelming it. By November 4th, as system administrators applied the patches, the infection seemed to subside. However, while the attack was over, there were still a lot of unanswered questions on the table.
Universities and research centers are still recovering tonight from a computer virus that brought a nationwide network to a standstill.
A weird creature had crashed a significant portion of the internet, so naturally people wanted to know why, and most importantly, who was behind it. The answer came just one day after the attack. A journalist from the New York Times received an anonymous call. On the other end, a university student explained that his friend, RTM, was responsible for the attack, but had intended no harm. It was simply a failed experiment. The journalist, as any journalist would, used that information to find the culprit. Ironically, he searched for RTM using Finger and found the worm's creator. His full name was Robert Tappan Morris, a Cornell student and son of the famous NSA cryptographer Bob Morris. And if that name rings a bell, it's because Bob Morris was the creator of the crypt system. Yes, that system that was supposed to keep user passwords protected. So technically, Morris's son had managed to exploit his father's own security architecture. And as a fun fact, Morris's fake crypt program was 7 times faster than his father's. And here starts yet another chapter in the Morris saga. Now they had the creator of the worm. But was he guilty after all? Some were convinced he was innocent. At the end of the day, he had highlighted critical vulnerabilities in the systems. Others, however, were not so sold on the idea of a kid playing God. The debate continued for several weeks, even though, to be fair, This was mostly reserved for computer geeks, since the mainstream public was still trying to figure out what the hell an internet virus even was. In fact, several experts had to clarify that the Morris worm was not an actual worm and couldn't harm humans.
It's not really a virus, it's a code, a set of instructions. This virus spreads by disk and by telephone. It's just a call away. And like a virus, it replicates like crazy.
Ultimately, things were settled in court. Robert became one of the first individuals to be prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Theoretically speaking, there was a framework to judge Morris. However, things were far from clear. He had not released the worm for profit. He was not working for foreign government. And technically, he had not damaged any files or documents. So, how exactly do you bring someone to justice when you're not even sure what injustice they've committed? Robert pleaded not guilty, but the consequences of his experiment were too big to ignore. Roughly 10% of the internet had been affected, and the damages were estimated somewhere between $100,000 and $3 million. Morris was eventually found guilty. He was fined $10,000, required to serve 400 hours of community service, and placed on probation for 3 years. He never returned to Cornell. Instead, he graduated from Harvard and eventually became a computer science professor at MIT. Our main character's arc was complete, but this was just the beginning for the internet. The incident had proven that worms could be brought to life, and that wreaking havoc was not as difficult as one might think. It was only a matter of time before worms and viruses became more sophisticated. Was cybersecurity ready to take on the new challenges ahead?
It certainly made the world more aware of the fact that there was this global networking phenomenon that was going on. Because at that point, it was mostly those of us who were specialists that we knew about it. But this brought it into a little larger focus. It also brought government attention in a way that had not currently existed.
Both the public and private sector pushed several initiatives to make the proto-internet more secure. For example, Unix released several patches as well as a wide range of free resources to make their customers more secure. At the same time, several experts established an initiative known as Computer Emergency Response Team, a coalition of scientists monitoring networks and software to make technology more secure. And sure, all of this sounds good on paper, but we have to be honest. Most of these initiatives were pretty useless. On the other hand, after the Morris worm incident, systems were still built with vulnerabilities, and most people were still pretty clueless about cybersecurity. And with the looming arrival of the World Wide Web, it was only a matter of time before those weaknesses were exploited once again.
What the Morris incident really didn't teach us is the need to be more focused on security and care and production of software and how we install things. Barely a week goes by now without some other major security vulnerabilities or flaws finding their way into publicity of major break-ins or compromises. And a surprising number of them have underlying software faults that are related to what were exploited by the Internet Worm Program. I think as a community, we've done a very poor job of internalizing the need and the importance of good security and good software development.
Thanks for watching. This is the story of the first worm to crawl through the internet, but there are many more. Let us know if you'd like to hear other stories about worms or any other internet creatures. Thank you, and see you soon.